This presentation is going to focus on tree installation and establishment. I'm going to look at some of the protocols that are involved specifically with balled and burlap material and also container grown trees. I will look at how to not only plant them properly, but some of the important considerations that go into post-planting maintenance, especially during that critical establishment period, and also talk about some maintenance details post-planting and during those first few years that can be real helpful in creating a more sustainable tree planting. Now, trees are an investment in our property. We know that. They're investment in our community as well. Choosing and planting a tree really should be a well-informed and planned decision. A well-planted and maintained tree is going to grow a lot faster and live a lot longer than one that perhaps wasn't given enough thoughtfulness. So the challenges for trees, especially in the urban forests, can be reduced by implementing best practices and current research in the process. Now, historically, we've been pretty good at this stuff as a civilization. In the past, many centuries ago, trees were planted primarily for food, timber, and then later a greater focus on greening cities. But the skill of tree planting has been around for a very long time. The ancient civilizations had gardens and orchards in which they transplanted that bore those useful crops. Um, and the trees were not only transplanted from the immediate area of a natural woodland, but also were collected and traded over great distances. Ancient Greeks and Romans were great tree planters, and the Romans left an extensive library of horticultural manuals on how they planted trees. And advice included back in those days, many centuries ago, advice included avoiding damage to the roots, digging a large enough hole, and actually marking a tree with red paint on one side before it was dug up so that it could be replanted in the same orientation to the sun and the wind. And some nurseries still do this today, and I believe that it does help reduce the opportunity for winter damage, such as sun scald and bark splitting. But again, we've learned a lot, and I think it's important that we stay current with research and best management practices so that we avoid, some of the not so good tree planting efforts. We've seen some pretty crazy things over the years, and they still continue. But what I'd like to focus on primarily is tree planting, doing it the right way. Now, you can ask many arborists and horticulturalists, the right way to plant a tree. And all of them have comparative protocols that are pretty consistent as far as planting pit and what to do with the containers and shipping materials and so forth. But what I'm going to do is in this presentation is really focus on what is most current with research. And over just the past 3 to 5 years, we've had a lot of new research developed that's changed our planting protocols. And I'm going to discuss some of that as we move along here. So let's first start out with the planting pit. Now, some of the challenges that I experience and I see and hear are listed here. It is so easy to go too deep. Shallow trees planted in too shallow of a planting pit is just as bad, but that excessive planting depth has led to a lot of new problems that we are seeing today, such as declined dieback, bark splitting on the trunk, as well as stability problems and tree failure as a result. How wide should the hole be? Well, there's research on that as well. And shape even. I've actually had every year a couple of questions usually cross my desk or my email platform that ask me about square planting holes. Well, that has been solved and researched. We'll talk about that a little later as well. And what is the current research actually saying about tree planting, and how and what are the answers to a lot of those questions? All right, let's start out with planting pit width. Now, back to that planting question about square holes. Actually, my colleague and friend down at the University of Florida, Dr. Ed Gilman, has been approached with that question as well, and we had a discussion about this just actually a few months ago. Whereas his response was he's planted thousands of trees in many sizes of containers and shapes, and he found that the same problems were consistent with the square shaped holes as the round holes, which is primarily the concern of stem girdling roots. So it does occur on square, and he has found no research or literature that supports that square holes are any better or provide any additional benefit other than the typical round planting pit. So anyway, planting pit, well, it depends. We like to get 1.5 times as wide as the ball. Now, research shows that, or excuse me, current literature, actually popular literature, I should say, says to plant it 2 to 3 times as wide as the ball. Well, really that depends on the available space and soil texture. Now, how often do you have the opportunity to dig a hole that is 2 to 3 times the width of your planting material? So if you look at the balled and burlap material here, this is about a 2-inch caliper tree, which means that's about a 24-inch ball. All right, let's do a little scenario role playing here. Now, if that's a 2-foot across diameter ball, and you're really wanting to do the right things, well, if let's say we want to dig it 3 times the size of that particular tree, that would mean we would have a 6-foot hole in which to plant that tree. Well, two things come to mind. One is, wow, that's a lot of work. And two, most importantly, how often do you have room to actually dig that kind of, or prepare that kind of planting pit? We often don't, as you can see in this image here. Um, Oftentimes we'll have a 4 to 5, and if we're lucky, maybe 6-foot wide planting strip or area in the landscape that we can construct our hole. Width is dependent upon the space, but also soil texture too. We need to look at the soil texture in relationship to the amount of sand, silt, and clay, and so forth, and compaction, specifically in urban areas. And also think about what we can do to create a larger planting pit to compensate for compaction. Now, research has indicated that planting hole width really has very little significant difference in the success or establishment of that tree, with the exception of very challenging compacted soils. And you can see in this, this was research done by Gary Watson at the Morton Arboretum, and he can see that in natural subsoil, we can be less aggressive with our planting configuration. But the more compaction that we encounter, we need to make some differences in our planting protocols. What we like to call the shallow wide configuration is often very helpful in soils where you may not have the opportunity to create a larger pit. Even on one side helps to make the pit a little larger, or even if you till an area about 6 inches deep around the tree so that you allow those developing roots, which are in the upper portion of the ball, to reach out into its host environment. That can help tremendously in overcoming the challenges with that severely compacted soil. Now, depth, well, that's another story. Planting pit width, Now, again, we get what we can take there, but at least make sure that we have at least 6 to 12 inches larger if possible, and then make those changes depending upon conditions. But planting depth is what we're finding in current research here is much more critical. Primarily, this is what we are seeing leading to whole tree failure as a result. But we've been instructed for many years, here in the last at least 5 to 10 years, to look for that root flare. And and if not, if we don't see it, then we need to find it. But also look for what we call the main order root level, where those more sturdy structural roots that are important for anchorage and establishment. Look for those if you can't find it. Now, this is what we want to typically search for, and oftentimes due to the nursery production protocols, trees are planted too deep in the nursery intentionally, mainly to keep them vertical and upright during that establishment period as a very, very small sapling. And as a result, oftentimes the root flare becomes buried, as you see in this image. But this is what we want to try to accomplish in our preparation of that tree prior to planting. Now, for many years prior to this research, we were instructed not to mess with the balled and burlap material at all and plant it at the same depth it was in the nursery. But we've learned through research from Gary Johnson in the University of Minnesota, and also Dr. Ed Gilman down in Florida, that that is not the case. This is actually what we want it to look like. We want to dig down as far as necessary in order to find that root flare. At that root flare is where the trunk begins to change in its composition and materials to actual underground rooting structures. So if we want to look for the correct depth, this is a little demonstration on how that might occur. This one isn't too bad, but you can see, I've just taken a soil knife here and actually moving some of the soil away from the pit, or excuse me, away from the root flare. So make sure as you move that soil away that you don't damage that cambium layer, because this is obviously where the vascular system of the plant is. You can see that's just really about 2 or 3 inches lower than I'd like to see. So again, I'm trying to make sure that we get down to where that trunk starts giving rise to the root material. I have seen it much deeper, but again, it depends on the nursery, size of the tree, and production protocols. So in the process, basically what we want to do is get rid of the burlap material. These are my students planting trees at one of the campus properties. Find that root flare, and you can see, as I mentioned, it can be much deeper. This is where the roots actually were on this particular tree. That's one of the deepest I've ever seen. It measured about 12 inches, 12 to 13 inches deeper. And you can also see this location here, and this is often confused with the root flare. This is actually a grafting knot. The majority of our trees, when I always say you're getting 2 for 1, basically, because you're getting the rootstock, which you have no idea what that tree might be, and then you're also getting the upper part, which is the grafted part of the scion. So you're actually getting 2 trees here, and you often don't know what the mystery tree, which is the rootstock. But anyway, where this grafting knot is often kind of flared out as a result, and oftentimes that is mistaken as the root flare. But you can see my students found the root flare much deeper. So again, once that's found, then that is your existing, planted with your existing grade. So had we planted it in where it was initially, we'd have planted it about a foot too deep. So that needs to be determined prior to final construction of your planting hole, so that you don't get it too deep either. So really, when it comes to every balled and burlap plant, I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I did not have to excavate some of the topsoil on the root ball, but I just assume it's too deep at installation, and that's when I start investigating the ball to determine where the actual root flare is, and it can be quite deep. Again, I've found it anywhere from 12 to 14 inches to just an inch or two. So, but any excavation you can do will be helpful. And then this is what our finished product looks like. Constructed earth rim for water, and then properly planted at the correct depth. When we do plant too deep, this is typically what we end up with. These are the consequences of excessive planting depth. And as I mentioned, it took about 30 years of research, but what we found was that trees that were planted too deep developed trunk splits, cracking and decay, which are cankers that developed right at the soil line, an increase in girdling roots, and then of course a decrease in stability, which led to failure. And this was found to be pretty consistent with trees got about 14 to 16 inches in DBH. And at that time, that's when we started seeing whole trees fail as a result. And I have a library of images that show exactly this picture that you see down here on the bottom right. But this is what I typically see, and I just scratch my head when I do see it. You can see that there is no root flare, and as a result, you notice that the trees are green in the background. Anytime you see early fall color, then that is an indicator that there is something certainly going wrong with the tree, especially in the root zone. So let's see, this is a common question that I get. Let's look at the rescue treatment for this particular situation. Good example that's been planted excessively deep. You should be able to see a root flare here, but you can see it looks almost like a telephone pole going into the ground. So this has been planted too deep. This will kill the tree. What will happen is this will get decay around the trunk and it'll eventually die. So what we're going to have to do is reestablish the grade, and that will involve pulling the mulch away and pulling the soil away until we get to the root flare. So we carefully pull the mulch away. We want to make sure that we don't damage the bark, because that's the cambium layer and that could cause problems. So I'm just going to take just a regular garden trowel. What I'm doing is just pulling away, and you can see still where the bark is starting to decay already. So we want to continue to pull this away until we find that root flare. This is buried, looks like about 4 to 6 inches too deep. So carefully excavate the soil. There I'm starting to see the flare. See how it's starting to come out? This is where it should have been planted, at about this depth. So this is about 4 inches or so too deep. So what I'll do is keep pulling this away. Keep pulling this away about a foot from the tree, so it's got a gradual taper down to this root flare. So this is about where we want to establish our grade. So if your tree looks like this, where it's planted too deep and you don't have that root flare, that angle, then you'll need to excavate the soil. Reestablishing the grade means pulling the soil away from the trunk and trying to level it out. So you can see I'm just using my trowel, just kind of shaving it away, pulling it back. Now you can either dispose of the soil, or one of the better things to do is just expand your mulch ring, because that means there's more mulch on the root zone. Just level it out, try to get it as close to where the root flare is as possible, but you don't have to dig up the tree or re-excavate the planting pit. Just level it out. Now we're ready to mulch. One of the most common mistakes with mulching is mulching too high. You want to make sure that you keep the depth about 2 inches to 3, and don't pile the mulch up against the bulk or against the tree, because you'll have the same problem that you did earlier. Mulch serves 2 purposes primarily. One is it keeps the soil moist so the tree doesn't dry out as quickly, and it's aesthetic. Again, just a light layer is all you need, and try to keep the bark mulch away from the trunk. That's really about all there is to it. Now, what about the transport material? Doesn't matter what we do with it, and what do we do with it? There's a lot of opinion on this, and some of it is not so good. And also there's the situation that we see quite common and more frequently than I like, is actually just leaving it on there entirely, which can certainly lead to the demise of the tree. So here are the recommendations. Again, this has been researched, and many arborists and horticulturalists have their own opinion as to this, but by and large, all of the research done and those that have been spent quite a bit of time with this experience all agree pretty much to the same conclusion, and we'll cover that here shortly. But first, I'd like to talk about excessive planting depth and what happens when we run into this situation. It does kill trees. It could be quickly, or it can be a slow decline over a period of time. But you can see with my soil knife here, this one was about 6 inches too deep, and that, as my meme says, we might as well be 6 feet under. So again, it's not a matter of if, it's when it will occur, and that depends oftentimes upon environmental conditions and the type of tree that you're actually dealing with here. But as far as finally installing those, the research indicates that we want to cut and remove basically the upper half of the wire basket and at least the upper half of the burlap. Now, and then finish pretty much as any other type of medium. The important thing here is we want to remove anything, which includes the twine and the rope and also the trunk guard. We want to remove anything that could impede the development of that tree as it establishes itself. And so that means that, especially with the root system, the wire baskets can cause damage and can cause some issues with root development. But the majority of your roots are in this upper portion of the soil. So if we can at least remove the upper half, then that creates a much better opportunity for those roots to develop. One of the drawbacks, especially of removing the entire um, transport package with the burlap and the wire cages, oftentimes you can have a complete disintegration of that planting ball. And when that occurs, that means you've lost all the soil and root interaction, and you're basically planting a bare root tree that's most likely in full leaf. And that can be a challenging experience. And also requires a lot different planting protocols completely, from constructing the planting pit to planting to post-planting maintenance, and also um, tree support system. So again, I don't think it's worth it to compromise the root ball in that situation, and just removing the upper half is certainly adequate. Okay, let's go into container installation. Now, smooth wall containers have been around for many, many years. Most prevalent is after World War II. And now I think that about half or more of our trees that we purchase are container grown, mainly due to availability and so forth. But they do provide their own specific challenges. As I mentioned earlier, you can see this red paint swatch on the tree, and it may or may not be significant. However, I do know that again, some nurseries would paint the north orientation on there, so the tree should be planted in the same orientation as it was in the nursery to help reduce sun scald and some other establishment issues as well. Again, we have some unique consideration here because of the construction of those pots and the smooth walls. We inherit and develop what is called stem girdling roots. As you can see below, one of the problems primarily is it doesn't stop. It's almost like the tree has been genetically coded, so to speak, if you will, to continue growing in that circular fashion as opposed to developing those lateral roots that extend into its new host environment. And then what you get is those compressive roots against the trunk, which restricts the vascular system and transport of food and water, and then creates decline and dieback, starting with the upper canopy and moving downward through the tree. You can see on a couple of these examples where the trees have been planted for a very long time. This one had been planted about 15 years, and that is the root. That is that large structural root that should be going, whoops, that should be going into the other direction, into the laterally into its environment. This one had been planted about 3 years, and you can see one lateral root did escape and started growing out where it should, but this one continued in that circling fashion. So as that tree gets larger, we'll expect ensuing problems along with it. A colleague of mine did create sort of an instructive chronological depiction of this issue. This was a small transplant that had been root pruned with the boxing or slicing process. And then here is one that was not. You can see that the girdling roots are pretty much still remaining the shape of that container, and it will continue to do so. Causing problem. So what do we do to correct this root dysfunction? Well, the best thing to do is just interrupt the process and basically prune the problem away, if you will. So I start here. I'm just measuring the depth to see if there is a little extra soil. You can find even sometimes on container trees, and it found that it was a little deep. Also, must remind you to remove the container. may sound simple and silly request, but I have investigated trees that have died as a result of the containers being left on. So this is what we see. A lot of roots and also growing in a very circular fashion. So previous research has indicated that if you score or slice the root system, that will interrupt the circling growing activity, but current research says it really had no significant difference um, as far as interrupting that. I did, after, as I mentioned, I did measure and found that this had been topped with about 2 inches of extra soil. So I started pulling that away to find the main order roots. And you can see that most of these were adventitious roots that were growing on top. And this is what I ended up with. Now you can see very significant and important root development here. This is a structural root that will be responsible for stability. And you can see that also it is hitting the side of the smooth wall container and growing down and circling. And so that's exactly the type of root we want to correct prior to planting. Otherwise, it will just continue in this fashion. Here's a close-up of that. You can see a lot of girdling here internally. And also this diving root as a result and actually growing back into the containers. So that's certainly one that we want to correct in the process. So what we have been instructed to do is called either boxing or slicing. So you will take a pruning saw, preferably one that you're not going to be using in the future for pruning, because soil and saws really don't get along very well together and dull them pretty quickly. But I have one that I use specifically for tree planting and for interrupting these girdling roots. And so what I'll do is I'll cut the sides off in all 4 cardinal directions, just about a 1-inch deep slice off of the root. So you can see basically what I'm doing here is just a broad brush pruning process to get rid of those circling and girdling roots and basically creating a new root system as a result. So this is what the final product would look like. And you can see our friend here, our important root basically was cut, and it's just like pruning. So it should develop a flourish of new roots as a result that will grow laterally rather than being hampered by that the close proximity of that smooth wall container. So here's a video example of that process, and you can see we're basically just cutting off the outer edge of that root system to get rid of that circling personality, if you will, of that particular tree. Again, 4 sides is typically adequate. You don't really need to get too particular with it, but some of those roots can be pretty thick down there. And again, as a result of that pruning, we can expect development of a whole new root system. So sometimes I will cut the bottom because some of the roots that go straight down, some of the more taproot type of growth, once it hits the bottom of the container, it will deflect and grow back straight up into the root wad. So that can be a problem as well. So then we've pretty much just discussed the preparation of the planting ball or planting media itself, each with specific protocols as far as container grown trees in relationship to balled and burlap. But the final step of installation is pretty much the same. We want to make sure we get proper grade and proper depth. Look at the backfill. Again, I get lots of questions about this. What should I use? What should I be putting into it? Well, the idea is to use native soil whenever possible. Avoid the use of any type of additives, especially sand, peat, or compost, humus, anything that can actually add more moisture or excessive amounts of moisture into that rooting system. Oftentimes, some of these additives can actually hold moisture longer, which prevents good drainage, and an extended period of time those roots are wet can cause fungal issues. Fertilizers are especially not recommended at planting due to the development of those fine roots, and also allocation of resources for the tree during establishment. Also the gels, wetting agents, again, research has shown that there's really no significant difference in development that I've seen. So now, there, in some situations, especially in these very challenging urban areas, there might be the necessity for some amendments, but those are special planting protocols that need to be administered and reviewed carefully. But just modification makes a huge difference in the ability of that tree to establish itself quickly and effectively. There is a huge difference between amendments and modifications. They may sound similar, but amendments indicates that you're adding something to the soil, where modification means that you're manipulating the soil. And just the simple act of digging the hole and putting the soil back is a modification. Basically, you've broken up the compacted soil. You've made it a little more loose, so that the roots can establish themselves more quickly. So just the fact that you're planting the tree can help modify the backfill if that's what you're using in the planting process. So some other important steps, obviously remove any non-beneficial plant parts, conduct some structural pruning. We'll talk about that here in a little more detail shortly. Make sure you tamp lightly or water as you add the backfill in order to remove those air pockets. And of course, remove any strings or tags or anything that can girdle the tree later on, because that's certainly an issue that cannot be mitigated or repaired or improved. All right, let's get into some of the post-planting care. We've got our tree in the ground. Now what do we need to do to create a sustainable tree with a good establishment period so it can get into its maturity on its own? Now, mulching does matter. There are some people who don't advocate for use of mulch, but it does reduce evaporation and improves moisture retention most of all. But the thing that I think it does best is mainly as a visual cue to protect that tree from mechanical damage. Now, I'm sure we've all seen where some of these guys that are running these zero turn radius machines at 40 miles an hour often aren't the most cautious around trees. But if we keep a nice mulched drip line of the tree, especially during that those first few years, that tender cambium layer can be protected from guys like these. Then, of course, using the appropriate mulch that has been properly composted and also free of dyes. Some of those dyes have been reported to be phytotoxic and also can stain nearby infrastructure as well. Now, remulching, sometimes it needs removed and refreshed. In my early years of college as a student working in planting trees, I often removed as much mulch as I replaced. Oftentimes we'll see these mulch volcanoes and we have several inches of mulch up against the trunk that can cause some serious issues later. But again, it's good to remove those surface adventitious roots and establish a proper level and grade of mulch. When we do create that mulching construction, we want to at least get out 2 to 4 feet on smaller trees and create about a 1-inch gap near the trunk, and then taper it so that we get good distribution of any water coming into the vicinity of that tree planting, as you can see here. Now, we don't have to get too concerned about the um, bark touching the trunk. It's just we don't want it piled up against it. It's all right to touch it. It's just we don't want to have an excessive amount in and around there that can harbor insects, create a home for the little furry creatures, and also extend the amount of time that moisture is up against the trunk, which can lead to decay. So with the mulch process, again, I really like to see mulch out to the drip line of the tree, because that's where the critical root zone is, especially. But again, oftentimes that can be a personal preference as far as, and also a design implication as far as creating a balance of mulch with turf and so forth. But you can go to, again, 2 to 4 feet around the base of the tree. And this covers the root flare and the immediate root plate. Again, primarily on a tree this large, it's mainly to protect the tree from mechanical damage, but also it does provide some health benefits, especially the ones that are mulched out to the drip line. But again, that's often a very site-specific decision. And also there is some expense to maintaining those large mulch rings. But they do provide a much better growing environment for the tree, especially on sensitive trees like this beech. We want to keep any type of activity, especially a lot of mowing equipment and so forth, and then also some trees, this is especially important for those shallow rooted species, especially natural riparian trees like these maples. It's challenging to get that turf to grow below these trees, just mainly due to the competition and location of those roots. So establishing these large tree rings can have some other benefits as well. Ground covers do not make good mulching materials, especially when you're using euonymus species, the winter creeper. One, it's very competitive, but two, it's also invasive. So those are the types of things we don't want to maintain. They're also very high maintenance as far as pest issues, and also the pruning that's required for these as well. One thing we don't want to see again are these mulch volcanoes where rodents can hide, just like a nice little condominium for rodents during the winter, and also creates an environment to where we have excessive amounts of moisture for prolonged periods, which can cause issues as well. So also, we want to make sure that we have it at the proper depth. This is not acceptable. You might as well have planted it deeper into the soil. Mulch is not a good answer for compensating for shallow root systems or the ability to dig holes deep enough. I have seen that on several new construction sites where the soil is so horribly compacted that you can't get the hole deep enough. And as a result, they plant the tree too shallow and then add excessive amounts of mulch to try to compensate for that lack of depth. But more mulch doesn't mean better conditions for the plant in any sense. Just a couple of funny examples here of mulching. Of course, concrete is certainly not a good mulch alternative either. Some resources available to you. Tree installation processes and practices. This is FNR 433 available at the Purdue education store. And there's also a video on how to plant trees that discusses a lot of things that I discussed in this particular webinar. Also, a new publication that's just available this year, that surface root syndrome and what to do with those, is just been added to the Purdue Education Store. So it talks about mulching and how to deal with those particular roots, and especially what not to do when you have that problem, trying to create good turf and tree interactions. All right, let's look at protection systems, and doesn't matter whether or not we put them on or how we place them. So we're going to look at tree wraps and talk about that a little bit, as well as tree supports such as staking and guying. Now, trunk wraps have been somewhat scrutinized as far as their benefits and their disadvantages. If you're going to use them, the best thing to use is a white flexible plastic, in order to accommodate tree growth, and also not accumulate heat behind the wrap, especially when you use darker colors or darker PVC. Those white flexible wraps that expand as the tree grows is the much safest option, mainly because oftentimes the wrap is forgotten about and the trunk wrap is left on for a very long time, like you see here, and the tree just kind of expands, and the trunk wrap expands along with it. So again, that expansion is so critically important. It can protect from the winter sun. Now, some research indicates it really has no significant difference even on smooth barked juvenile trees, but it can be harmful if it isn't inspected and adjusted. Now, again, it's a good idea to raise that and look behind it to see if there's any decaying organisms or insects present that could be causing some damage there. So you can have some issues under some of those wraps, especially the solid paper wraps that we still see today on the market. You can get, again, an accumulation of insects and also prolonged or excessive wet conditions, which can cause issues. Now, tree support systems, a lot of different types available. Again, whether or not they're necessary is very situational. It does add some protection, especially in exposed areas where you have a lot of wind, and that can cause the tree to kind of wallow around in the planting pit. So it does provide stability when it's needed in those situations. It does reduce theft, and also help with mechanical damage. Whenever you see those large stakes and wires coming out from the tree, the guys on the mowing equipment tend to stay away from that so they don't damage their equipment. The drawback is it does become somewhat prohibitive to good trunk taper and development, because a tree is not moving with the normal wind conditions and developing that strong taper and trunk development. And when it comes to staking trees, we have some new kits out there that are available, but again, it's either right or it's very wrong, and can be basically very prohibitive to growth, and can actually kill the tree. Some of the more prominent tips to keep in mind is make sure you don't stake it, or excuse me, wrap it or tie it too tight. Don't create your staking points too high on the tree, and most certainly don't leave it on too long. So this is some situation, again, where trees should have been supported with the right tree support systems, because of exposure to the prevalent wind conditions. You can see the the ball's just kind of wallowing in that hole as a result, and the root system's never going to establish. And then, of course, on windy sites, evergreens are like a big sail, and oftentimes these evergreens are very shallow rooted, which creates them to be more prone to wind throw. And of course, when you leave on the staking materials too long and especially too tight, you can actually see where this one had been girdled and created a very weak, vulnerable point in that tree with the right wind loading, blew over. But this girdles the tree and prevents the movement of the transport of those essential nutrients and water that flows, and as a result, the decline and dieback in the upper canopy. Another good resource to help you with that decision making on tree support systems is available again through the Purdue Education Store. One of the most important things as far as establishment and the planting process is watering. We want to make sure that adequate water is supplied to the tree during that especially critical first 2 to 3 years. Water is the single most ecologically limiting factor involved in the sustainability of that tree, and even for trees that have been in the ground for a longer period of time. But we want to water as needed and not on a particular calendar schedule. Most plants require at least 1 inch of water per week. I like to use the 5+5 ratio as far as how much water to provide on a weekly basis. So that would be 5 gallons of water plus 5 for every inch of diameter. So a 3-inch tree would require up to 20 gallons of water. So, but again, we want to be careful not to overwater due to the fact of taking in consideration soil textures. The best thing to do is get in there and check to make sure that it actually does need water. Transpiration rates and water loss vary each day. 95% of the tree's water is lost through its leaves. Wind speed, temperatures, humidity all play a role in that, as well as soil textures. But again, get in there and check it. And also, if you're using those gator bags, make sure you check those and remove them when not in use. This is one that had been left on for about 2 years and never taken off. And you can see the decay starting to establish in that lower trunk. So get underneath and look. You create the perfect environment for fungal decay whenever you have that cool water going into the bag and it creates a condensation behind it against the trunk. There's very little light. And then as a result, we get the establishment of that disease on the trunk. Lift it up if you see some of those wood decaying insects that like to frequent those that specific type of environment, like pill bugs, millipedes, and so forth. Then that's indicative of prolonged moisture and decaying wood. So we want to make sure that we monitor those and especially remove them when they're not in use. Now, what about the pruning when it comes to early tree establishment and planting? Well, there's been some changes in that protocol as well. Years ago, prior to current research, it was recommended that we prune to compensate for root loss in the digging process for balled and burlap plants. But we soon learned that that was counterproductive to our efforts, in the fact that by removing live green tissue, we're also removing that tree's ability to create photosynthates, an essential food for recovery of that root system. So again, we don't want to remove a lot of excessive live green tissue. But the one thing we do want to do is is establish a strong central leader. So we can prune to promote good branch structure in that process. Also, first step is removing what I call non-beneficial plant parts, and that's removing the dead or dying or perhaps damaged branches. As you can see on this one, any crossing branches that could create wounds, things like that. The most important thing is making sure that we take a look at the tree holistically and overall, so that we can create a good, strong, sustainable structure. It's what I call the holistic approach to arboriculture. It's much more economical to prune these trees ground-based when they're young, developing that good structure, rather than waiting till the tree becomes medium aged, and the expense and also the wounds that accompany pruning larger trees makes it less favorable for that tree in recovery and establishment. So when we do prune these younger, newly established trees, we have smaller wound size, which means a faster healing time as well. But we want to make sure we develop that central or dominant leader system, identify the lowest branches, and then also we have temporary branches, but as well as permanent. So it takes some experience and some education on to how to properly prune that tree. Now, obviously, we can't prune it to its final stages while it's in the establishment period, because we would be removing an excessive amount of material here. We want to get 8-foot clearance on this bike trail and sidewalk. But again, we need to wait until the tree develops, and we may need to visit this tree 2 or 3 times over the next 10 years in order to get it to its proper growing shape. So with improving structure, what I'm talking about primarily is, again, try to restore apical dominance in the canopy, and also remove any weak co-dominant stems that we typically see on many of these young trees that we purchase for planting. So in this situation, you can see where we have a typical co-dominant, which means we have 2 stems of equal size trying to compete for that central dominant leader. With this one, the decision was pretty easy. We want to take the one that's most vigorously growing and vertically straight, and then remove its competing counterpart here. To get this situation. Now, we got a few things up here at the top we still need to prune. But again, we're creating that dominant leader. And with the removal of this, 2 things happen. One, we've removed the necessity to actually support that branch. So that means there's more resources available for the rest of the tree in this location. And also by removing this branch, it improves the amount of light hitting the trunk. Light inhibits auxins. So the cyanokinins will become more prevalent here, and these lateral branches will actually receive more growth hormones as well as more nutrition, and these will start expanding into proper lateral branches at a later time. So again, the process is strategically sound, but also scientifically effective to improve that stability and sustainability of that tree by pruning during that establishment period. Now, pruning dose you really need to take a look at. This was a chinkapin oak on campus that one of my students and I had is using as an example. Now this tree's been planted about 10 years, but it wasn't it wasn't pruned effectively for a good solid structure. And so we removed one of the co-dominants to improve that situation. But how much should you take off during this establishment period? Well, the standards say that you should not remove any more living material than you actually need to achieve your objectives. So we need to think about what are we doing as far as achieving our structural pruning goals, but are we removing an excessive amount that's going to be counterproductive to that tree's health? So again, we want to focus on those non-beneficial plant parts that we really don't count against us on our pruning dose, especially when it comes to dead or dying or damaged. But again, when we're looking at live green tissue, we need to collectively determine how much can we take off. And with young, vigorously growing trees, you can take 30 to 40% of your canopy and still, again, not have detrimental consequences as a result. And this was taken out of the Tree Pruning Essentials publication on the Education Store. But this was discussed and researched with some of my colleagues, and we pretty much agreed on these as starting guidelines for how much pruning dose to that's I guess, possible without expecting any type of response from the tree. So on young, newly established trees, you can take 50% of the canopy without having detrimental consequences. And then medium age trees, we're looking at the 25 to 50-year trees. And then you can see as we go older with the tree, less live green tissue should be removed at any one pruning session. So again, those are all relative to the health of the tree at the time of pruning, how vigorously growing it is. Timing during the year makes a big difference in how the tree responds as well, because with excessive pruning or a heavy pruning dose, you can create a growth spurt and response, and you can see new branches and leaves develop, which may not harden off in time for the cold winter weather, and you can't have damage as a result of that. Again, fertilization and during establishment, not recommended at planting time for a couple reasons. We have a limited root system available to take it up. It can create a salt-like, a responsive burn. And it also requires energy and resources in order to metabolize that. So we don't want to create a resource strain on that tree. It's using its resources to try to reestablish its root system. And charging the metabolism is certainly not going to be helpful. But again, before you do any type of fertilization, make sure you do a pH and soil test just to see where you're at, and perhaps help with your plant health care strategies as you move forward with that tree. All right, so to finish up, I'd like to bring your attention to the landscape report, the Purdue Landscape Report. If you have not signed up to that, you can find us on Facebook and also get on our mailing list. It's a bi-weekly newsletter that provides a lot of information, current emerging issues, trends, arboricultural practices, which are very helpful to the green industry professionals, right down to the home tree owner and gardeners. So I urge you to take advantage of that. And then also, again, I made reference to the Purdue Education Store. All these are free downloads that are available to you. Just go to Purdue Education Store and then click on Urban Tree Care, and that'll take you right to all those examples of publications, from pruning to planting to selecting a tree to surface roots, fertilization, all of those things that will help the tree owner. So with that, I'd like to thank the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the Community and Urban Forestry Program, which has provided grants and support to provide training and webinars just like this. Also the continued support of the Indiana Arborist Association, and finally Purdue Extension in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department. So I hope that this was a helpful webinar on tree planting and establishment, with a little bit in there as far as our helpful planting and post-planting maintenance, especially with the pruning and fertilization. So if you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of me through my email. That's lapurcell@purdue.edu. And typically I can get those questions answered pretty quickly. So thank you, and have a great day.